No one expected the war to last as long as it did, so trenches needed to be built. The first trenches were quickly and sloppily made. These trenches were holes dug by soldiers to protect themselves from the enemy. With modern weapons, even a shallow hole could well protect soldiers from the enemy. However, these hastily constructed defenses often flooded and collapsed. These trenches became deeper and more elaborately made further into the war, once the front line was less chaotic. Trench construction was very difficult. According to the British Trench Guidelines, it took nearly 6 hours for 450 men to construct 250 meters of trench. After this, they would have to add the other materials needed: barbed wire, boardwalks, and sandbags, for example. There were 3 main ways of constructing trenches: entrenching, sapping, and tunneling. Entrenching is a method of digging that involves standing on the ground and digging downwards. This method was the most efficient, as it allowed for many men to construct a trench at once. However, it also left the men exposed to the enemy, like snipers or patrols near them. Sapping was digging at the ends of trenches inwards. Only a few men could do this at a time. Tunneling is exactly as it sounds. It's like sapping, but leaving ground overhead that would later be removed. Trenches were great for staying hidden when enemy snipers were looking for a target. Many soldiers died on the first day by peering over the parapet of the trench and getting shot by an enemy sniper, but the dirt walls otherwise protected the soldiers from fire. They also provided a shelter, even if it wasn't the best for living in. It also gave good cover from the weather, but a direct hit from an enemy fire on the trench could collapse it, burying people inside, ultimately killing them. However, aside from the good that came out of the trenches, there are also many cons. 1/3 of the casualties on the Western Front happened in the trenches. There were millions of rats, which were a constant problem. The 2 main rats that lived in the trenches were brown and black, but the brown rat was feared much more because it would feed on the remains of dead soldiers. This rat could become as big as a cat. Soldiers would try and get rid of them in many ways, which included clubbing, bayonets, and shooting, but 2 rats could produce up to 900 rats in a year. This added to the contamination of food and infection. Lice in the trenches would cause trench fever, an extremely painful disease. The symptoms of trench fever were headaches, skin rashes, inflamed eyes, and leg pains. Recovery took up to 12 weeks. The smell in the trenches was awful and mostly consisted of rotting carcasses, overflowing latrines, sweat and feet, cresol or chloride of lime, and to add to these smells, the lingering odor of poison gas, rotting sandbags, stagnant mud, cigarette smoke, and cooking food. The men got used to it, but it overcame first-time visitors. One duty in the trenches was sentry duty, or sentry go, as known to British soldiers. Many of the men in the trenches feared and greatly disliked this duty, and with good reason. Sentry duty was an unpleasant job. Most sentries were assigned the job of walking up and down the fire trench near the parapet, keeping a close eye on the enemy across the no-man's land zone. The sentry's main duty was to alert the others in the trench in case of an attack, but sentries were also expected to keep tabs on enemy movement. Sentry duty was dangerous. Unless a soldier used a periscope, which was hard to use on the move, he had to be high enough to see over the top of the trench, which meant exposing himself to sniper fire. Sentries were also expected to do whatever they could to defuse small enemy bombs that made their way into the trench. It's not surprising that sentry duty was mentally and physically tiring. Being a sentry meant constantly scanning the horizon for something out of the ordinary. An hour or 2 of being a sentry was hard for most men. Many soldiers mentioned their responsibility in Lender's home, and more than a few sentries were found asleep on their feet at the back edge of their trenches. Falling asleep was very likely for those sentries that didn't move throughout the trench. The penalty for sleeping on duty could be as severe as death by firing squad. Not all men were needed as sentries. A second group helped move supplies back and forth between the fire trenches and the support trenches between them. This type of work could be difficult or easy, depending on the weather, the general level of exhaustion, and the types and weight of supplies being carried. Ammunition, food, and other materials were in constant demand in the front lines, and the narrow, winding communication trenches were not that much fun to navigate, carrying lots of items. There was also another job, night patrol. Night patrol was worse than night sentry duty by far. While sentry duty generally required soldiers to stay in or at least very near the trenches, patrol meant venturing out into no man's land. The goal was to be in earshot of enemy's fire trenches or as close as possible. With luck, they might capture someone or overhear bits of conversation, which was more valuable for soldiers who spoke the enemy's languages. It is possible Patrol's most important goal was to establish a presence in the neutral zone, telling the enemy he was prepared for an attack. Here is an example of a letter written by a soldier in the trenches. The rats don't seem to mind where they go, just as leave run over your face at night as to try and get your bread in the daytime. I don't think they like me very well, as I have my loaf of bread hung from the ceiling on a wire, and one thing a mouse or rat can't do is climb down a wire to the loaf of bread, which I am not at all sorry of. I do believe if any of you were placed in this bloody wet dugout, with all these pesky rats, mice, and lice, wet trenches outside, no baths or change of clothes, shoes and leggings covered with this clay stuff, wet wood to burn, and a measly little candle for light, that's not half of it. Yet I am comfortable, for I am well, happy, for I get plenty of good eats, and contented, for I feel lucky to even have this much. Paul. Here is another example of a letter. Dear Mother, one afternoon I and 12 or 15 of the men in our company were left in camp while the rest of the company were out delivering ammunition. Long-range guns were dropping high explosive shells over us and scoring a few direct hits on the hospital. These shells were falling only about 300 yards over and beyond us and were going directly over us. We didn't feel much danger as the shells were going over, and anyway there are a few dugouts in this town, so we were laying out on the grass. But later those gunners became careless with their range and shells and started to drop first on one side and then another. Every time we heard the whistle of a coming shell we would duck just the same. Your son, Corporal R.T. Bainbridge. The death toll of World War I was so large that people at the time could not begin to comprehend the amount of destruction the war had caused. More than a third of Serbians who fought died on the battlefield. Germany and Australia lost more than 3 million soldiers combined, most of them being Germans. On the Eastern Front, Russia alone lost over 3 million soldiers. France lost over 1 million, Great Britain also close to that amount. Many, but not all, of these losses were near or in the trenches. A large amount of soldiers that survived suffered severe wounds. Soldiers went blind from poison gas or lost a leg from a grenade. It is estimated that half the men who saw action in the British front lines were either killed or suffered at least one wound during the conflict. Disease was also very common throughout the war. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed from illness. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, measles, and other illness spread quickly in the tight quarters of the trenches. At best, they incapacitated the men for several days or weeks. At worst, they brought death. It was common for corpses to remain where they had fallen for days, weeks, or even months. Gradually, they sank into the mud and grit of no man's land, or sometimes into the trenches themselves. After a while, other soldiers might have retrieved the dead man's boots, jacket, or anything that could be reused. Badly decomposed bodies sometimes cause men to vomit when they are burying the body. Seeing the dead or composed bodies of their friends and fellow soldiers was hard on many of the men. Families of the dead soldiers would often receive letters from their country's government. In some cases, they also got a comforting letter from the man's commander or close friend of the man who died. The letters usually explained how well-liked he had been, or how much he had grown as a person and a soldier during his time on the front. Occasionally, they described the man's death, which in letters frequently said it was honorable and quick. No doubt some of the men actually did die like this, but in some cases the description was false, written to comfort the family. A wound could come at any time for a soldier in the trenches. A shell might explode too far away to kill a man, but close enough to cause damage. A sniper bullet might graze an arm or hit a leg. Gas attacks often failed to kill, but caused burned lungs and scarred flesh. Of course, some men died from their wounds. This was especially true of those who were hit in the stomach, head, or chest. Most of the wounded soldiers, however, survived.